private life was she, after she'd been a debutante, she'd been courted by the Prince of Wales. She eloped with an Austrian count, an impoverished, he was impoverished European nobility. And that was also something that rich girls in the United States used to do, a lot like an Edith Wharton novel, Buccaneers. She had all that money, all the nobility was interested in these girls. So she did that. Then she lived, and I'm doing it in quick summary, she lived that very heady expatriate life in Europe, lots of money, lots of lunches in Paris and at Lady Mendel's house down in the Trianon. She lived that great high life, and then the war came. When the war came, she also did what a lot of American society did. She returned to the U.S. and she got involved in the war effort. And her story gets richer here because of the background, what was going on in her personal life, and we'll talk more in detail about that. But in terms of the range of her life, so she goes back to the U.S., works in the war effort in wartime Washington, and then at the end of the war, what does she do? America is rather drab, but their gaze has turned to Hollywood. She has an affair with Clark Gable, and she goes to Hollywood, and she becomes part of that. It's at the end of all of that that she finally finds her way to Taos. Clark Gable breaks her heart. Her friends, Gilbert Adrian, he's married to the actress Janet Gaynor. They bring her to New Mexico, and a whole new phase of her life begins here. And about a quarter of the book talks in detail about her life here in Taos. And, you know, I started out when I would talk about Millicent assuming that Taoseños and New Mexicans would be more interested in her life in New Mexico and in Taos. And then I found that because we know about that, sometimes people wanted to know much more about her life in society and in New York and in Europe. So that's the summary of her life. Going into more detail about that, there were some key points in Millicent's life. She was born in 1902. At this point, her grandfather, who was a clerk in a grocery store, had gone off and made all that money. When he died in 1909, Millicent was 7 years old. Her father inherited $75 million, the equivalent of $2 billion, well, the year I finished the book, so 3 years back. So a lot of money. And Millicent led that life, but like all good stories, there was a menace in her story. When she was 8 years old, she contracted rheumatic fever and was not expected to live to be more than 10. This would plague her all of her life. This was the days before penicillin. And she had to watch her heart and be careful of everything for the rest of her life. Her father, unlike her grandfather that made all the money, took that money that he inherited, built a huge palazzo, would be considered new money today, on 2,000 acres in Southampton. And it was a fabulous backdrop for Millicent because she was a debutante. They threw lots of costume parties. She always had a great sense of flair. And it was from there that they began to launch her. And by launch her, families with that kind of money at that time took the winter season and invariably went to Europe. And that was what they did with Millicent. Now, there was a point where the Prince of Wales had come here and found her very delightful. And the parents, the Rogers had all that money, but in some ways they weren't the real center of New York society. They weren't part of Mrs. Astor's 400 out of Newport. So they were climbing a little bit in that they were very happy to have this beautiful daughter that everyone was after because of all the money being pursued by all the European noblemen. After she was a debutante, big affair in New York, 2,000 people invited. She quickly did the things she was supposed to do. She became engaged to a nice young man in the steel business. But on the family's next grand tour to Europe, one feels that the attention that she was getting from dashing European noblemen, that boyfriend began to pale, his attraction. So she broke that engagement. I had the good fortune as a reporter in talking to the daughters of some of the other debutantes that had gone on grand tours with Millicent, that said their mothers remembered being with her on such trips, and that about every week they would have to move and keep going because so many men would stand up to propose to Millicent. They knew she was the Standard Oil heiress, they knew she had that money, and they were after that. So Millicent was going along at this point the way girls of her social caste and life did until 1924, and as her family was in the Ritz-Carlton Hotel in New York preparing to go on a grand tour, she did the thing that would change her fortune and in some ways her whole family's life for a long time to come. As they were preparing, and it was a grand life, the maids were coming to get the trunks to take them to the dock in New York Harbor to set the family on this trip, Millicent eloped downtown in City Hall with an Austrian nobleman twice her age that in his memoir, which was provided to me by his descendants in the Rogers family, he said that though before World War I, he had had an income of $9,000 a year. Now he was down to about 40 cents. And it was assumed that he was a fortune hunter. He and Millicent married. And again, there are wonderful details that come from his diary and talking to the family. And I'm going to do that terrible writer thing and say, you must read them in the book, because I can't get too bogged down in them. But she eloped with Count Salm. Her father was outraged, absolutely outraged, and was determined to put an end to this marriage. So she and her count got on the ship and went to Europe, where he really had no money. Millicent's father gave them $20,000, which they went through very fast, traveling around Cannes, buying clothes, going to casinos. Her father mounted a campaign with his lawyer. They came to Paris. He checked into the Champs-Élysées Hotel, summoned Millicent and her husband up, and within 3 days had basically bought her back for $100,000. The Austrian family agreed to let her go. She gets on the boat with her father, said this is what we're going to do, and his lawyer. I've always imagined that this was the cruise from hell for Millicent, but Millicent was 5 months pregnant. So the plot thickens even further. You think, well, maybe she could have, what was she thinking? Now, I'm a journalist and I'm not very comfortable telling people what I think people were thinking, but if it's been in a letter, if it was quoted in a newspaper, then I will go ahead and say this is what was on her mind, or what we can assume was being thought. Because Millicent wrote letters after she came back home to her mother-in-law, the Countess Feeney in Austria, and she made quite a case that she expected to come home, make nice, have the baby, and that this situation would go the way most situations like this went, that the father would get over his fury, they would come into the money, and it would be okay. But that was not the way that Colonel Rogers saw it. And in the end, it took 3 years, and again, lots of details of amazing daring do with Count Salm trying to come and see his infant son, being met and searched for letters or contraband. He finally gives up after 3 years. Millicent has the baby, and he grants the divorce that her father is so invested that she get. So her life is started somewhat again, and she, in very short order, marries an Argentine aristocrat who has a little bit more money and background than Count Salm, Arturo Peralta Ramos. He's not terribly rich, but he's from a distinguished newspaper family in Argentina, and they live mostly in Paris and seem to have quite a terrific life. They certainly had a terrific courtship, in that Peralta Ramos, now Millicent wasn't under locks as she had been before she was a debutante, before she eloped. He courted her through the French countryside. The story is that they would have lunch in one chateau and call ahead to see what was being served at dessert in a few others nearby, and then go to the one that they wanted. So he knew how to court a lady, was how it was put to me. So she marries Peralta Ramos. They have 2 sons. You of Taos maybe have known both of these, and certainly know one, Arturo, who is still living, who was her middle son. She has 3 sons. She has Peter Salm, who was the baby of the Austrian count. This is always when I wish I had a blackboard, because it's complicated.